So I guess just for the sake of everyone, so I guess the people who are listening now are probably already very familiar with everything and how malt works and probably read the white paper and such. But because this recording is going to be distributed, I'll kind of start from the start and give a rough overview of where we've come from and what we're doing and where we're heading to. So for those of you who don't know who we are, we're Malt Protocol. My name is Scotch. I work with a great team of people who have been working on this idea for a stablecoin for years at this point. It was 2.5 years ago that I first started working on the idea. We launched our first version about 2 years ago this month, and that didn't go so well, so we grew pretty quickly. We got to 60 million TVL or something like that, and then unfortunately some issues with the code caused us to have to shut it down. But the great thing about all of that was we learned a ton about how the protocol works and how, importantly, how it didn't work. So we moved on, we built a second version of it. The second version, I would say, worked. Other people may disagree with me, but we shut it down as well because, unfortunately, we launched the very day that UST collapsed. So that was not good time for anyone. So we had to shut that down just to save ourselves because realistically, we weren't going to be driven by our egos so much to think that we could survive launching an algorithmic stablecoin the day that UST died. So we shut it down. But again, just like in V1, we learned a ton of information about how the protocol worked. And importantly, again, how it didn't work. So we went back to the drawing board and started to fix all the things that didn't work. And for those who were familiar with V2, there very little has actually changed in V3. And I will give an overview of the whole mechanism for those not familiar, but I'm speaking to those who know V2. So if you know V2, you pretty much know V3. We just changed a few things. We tweaked things a little bit. So I'll give the high-level TLDR for the V2 people, and then we'll go into a general overview of everything. So the thing that has majorly changed from V2 to V3 is the swing trader's behavior. So if you're familiar with V2, you'll know about this kind of infamous account that left the LP position in Malt and V2, and they left for about $3 million, give or take. And in doing so, they ended up draining pretty much all of the swing trader, and that was because the swing trader was just not very smart. It was just indiscriminately buying, and that resulted in it just buying this guy's whole stack off of him. And that was great for him, but not so good for the protocol. And we learned a huge amount from that. So we realized the swing trader had to be smarter. So we've coded in this kind of much more intelligent algorithm. And as I say, I'll go into more detail shortly. So that's kind of the big change. But we've also removed automatic auction participation, if you remember that. Now, instead of it going from swing trader to automatic auctions to public auctions in a waterfall manner, it's now auctions trigger before the swing trader, and there's certain rules that dictate how that happens. But that means that as an auction participant, you're no longer the last line of defense anymore. You now have the swing trader backing you up, which is a pretty big deal to have that the confidence. And we can now guarantee a price floor. And that's the thing that comes out of all of this that's the really big deal. If there's one takeaway point, it's that Malt can guarantee a price floor now, where it never used to be able to do that. And that necessarily lumped us in with all of the algo stables that have come before us. And I am moving away from calling Malt an algo stable because we're not anymore. We started off out of the ESD DSD mold, and it was natural to just continue the label of an algorithmic stablecoin. But the term algorithmic stablecoin has really grown into something that we're really not anymore. We're a fully collateralized coin under ideal conditions, but even under sub-optimal conditions, we're still collateralized to some degree, maybe not 100%. And that's really important to note, as opposed to the ESDs of the world where they had zero collateral at all. We don't have that. But this is kind of leads into the larger conversation that I think is interesting about what we've built here. So the larger conversation is how stablecoins have worked up until now. We can talk about broad categories. And we have like the USDCs of the world and the USDTs of the world. They're kind of the canonical stable coins today. Perhaps not the end goal for those of us who are kind of really seeing a bigger vision of DeFi. We don't want to lumber along with USDC forever. I think it's really useful, and I'm very glad it exists, but we need to be innovating. But the way those coins work is they fundamentally always value their token at $1. And it's because they make that assumption that their token is always worth $1, because as far as they're concerned, it is, because they're backed by it, without talking about any kind of solvency issues or any jiggery pokery that's happening behind the scenes. Just like, if it's working as stated, it's worth $1 because they have $1 in a bank account somewhere for it. So they're just like buying and selling, and them doing that is what's creating arbitrage, because there's a fixed point of value, which is the value that Circle denotes to USDC or Tether denotes to USDT or whatever. And in doing so, they're able to hold the peg very well. It's obviously centralized, but there's constraints applied to running a stablecoin like that. And the constraints in the case of USDC are these kind of mint redeem stablecoins that I'll talk about more generally. The problem with those is that because of their assumption that the coin's always worth $1 and they always value it at $1, they'll always buy it off you at $1 and they'll always sell you one for $1. That means that they can never profit from price movements in the market. And that's by design, right? That's their design. They don't want that. The question that we asked ourselves, and this wasn't initially, by the way, this wasn't like we came up with this radical idea and we suddenly tried to build it. No, we had an interesting thread to pull on with the mechanism, and over time, pulling on that thread and building it, we realized that this is actually what we've been doing all along. And the question that we're asked is it possible to apply a different set of assumptions instead of assuming that the token's always worth $1? And then those assumptions apply different constraints. And maybe those constraints do allow the protocol to profit from price movements in the market. Because traders profit from price movements in the market all the time. And a big part of the reason that you can't have a currency that profits from its own price fluctuations at a large scale come down to like conflicts of interest and things like that. But if you're fully automating on chain, the whole system is transparent. Everyone knows how it's going to work, and it's all executing in public transparently. We don't really have to worry too much about the conflicts of interest because there aren't any really, depending on how the kind of governance works and such. But just conceptually, the code is executing in a transparent way on chain, so we don't need to worry too much about the conflicts of interest. So if we can start thinking in that direction, what's possible? And really, what's come out of it is what we now call the Malt protocol, and that's a system whereby we make a different set of assumptions. And the assumptions that we make are two inequalities that we lay out in the white paper. And I won't go into too much detail about those if you're interested. They're in the white paper, and if you want to learn more, you can use MaltGPT or just DM me on Discord, Twitter, Telegram, wherever. I'm 0xScotch everywhere, so you can reach out to learn more. But other than that, the two kind of high-level metrics that we optimize for are called the collateral change inequality and the auction malt burned inequality. And what these two things mean fundamentally, if you were to get a soundbite of what these two things mean, the collateral change inequality means that we should always buy malt when it's trading at less than its current value, like its intrinsic value. If we've got 60 cents in collateral for every malt, if the market price is ever below 60 cents, we should buy. And if the collateral is ever above 60 cents, we should sell, is fundamentally what that's saying. There's a lot more happening inside that I'll talk about as well, because there's another kind of dimension that we think about, but I won't get into that right now. So we have that collateral change inequality. So all it's saying is just buy malt when it's cheap and sell malt when it's expensive. It's just a mathematical fancy way of saying that, really, fundamentally. And then the auction burned inequality is just fundamentally saying that we need to burn enough malt so that the auction process, the whole life cycle of the auction, never creates more malt than it destroys. Because we're having these auctions to rebalance economic instability in the supply and demand. So, and in the case of a DPEG, it's because the supply is outstripping the demand. So the price falls. It's basic economics, right? So if there's a mechanism by which you can recover the peg, but you're only doing so by minting more tokens to incentivize people to do an action, then you're actually just making the problem worse. And we've seen this happen time and time again with algorithmic stablecoins. They have these underpeg mechanisms that work initially because they can just mint more tokens to incentivize people to buy, and then that's the end of that. They've just recovered peg, everybody's happy, but they end up depegging again. The second depeg is worse, third depeg is even worse, and eventually it's ultimately death and they go to zero. So we needed to stop that from happening. So that's where the malt burned inequality comes in, so that we can ensure that we don't have economics that don't work in these situations. And when you combine those two things together, at a very high level, you have malt. That's really what we're trying to do. It's just an algorithmic stablecoin, if you want to call it that. But as I say, we're collateralized. But we use an algorithm internally to create the stability, but the stability is ultimately backed by collateral. It's just an automated system on chain for doing that. And then that in a nutshell, that's it, right? That's everything in Malt, from top to bottom. Then when you get into the details of how to actually implement this, many questions start to come out. So questions like, well, isn't this exploitable? Like, can't sandwich bots just rinse a swing trader? Or, I don't know, there's plenty of questions, but put myself on the spot, I can't really think. But there's plenty of questions that fall out of this line of questioning when you're trying to implement these things on chain. So that's where all of the rest of the things come from. And we've developed this system where we can almost have two different ways of operating Malt. And then we developed a system to allow ourselves to transition seamlessly between the two. So the two modes of operation. Mode 1, we can almost refer to as the Malt V2 mode. So this is a mode of operation where Malt, in its current form, fundamentally functions like V3, minus automatic auctions. But the swing trader behavior is very like V3. And that's where Malt's just aggressively trying to recover peg, always. And it's always willing to use the swing trader's funds to do so. And that's really good at recovering the peg quickly, as we saw in V2. But the problem with that is if it keeps going, it's unsustainable because we're going to run out of money. So we don't want to just run out of money. But it's really nice to have this system that does have the option, should it choose, to just aggressively recover peg. Because sometimes that's what we want. Sometimes it's like, we've depegged a little bit here, but like it's not a fundamental problem with the economics. It's just a large wallet has just sold a bunch and we've depegged a little bit. So we could just wait for it to recover, or we could just step in, recover the peg, and kind of not have to worry about people panicking. So that is a good thing. But we don't want to do that over and over again, because that's what happened in V2. We get drained, effectively. We lose a bunch of our collateral. So the other mode of operation is more of a fully collateralized, hard-pegged token to its intrinsic value rather than a peg to $1. So if the token has 80 cents of collateral, then its value, its target value, is 80 cents on the open market. So then if it had $1 of collateral for every token, then it would function like a dollar stablecoin. But it's constantly arbing itself and trying to do things, and its collateral is going to increase over time in theory, and it's going to buy and sell to try and capture value. And when it does that, its collateral grows, and over time, there's no real limit to how much its collateral can grow, because it doesn't artificially have to limit it. It doesn't say once I get to 100%, it's over, because 100% is implied based on the dollar hard peg. But the second mode of operation doesn't care about the dollar. It's just 80 cents and then 90 cents and then $1 and then $1.20. And as the collateral grows, that's what's going to happen. So that's the kind of second mode. That's just a fully collateralized, almost like inherently inflation proof to some degree, because as the market participants are trading on the token, there's going to be arbitrage opportunities and seigniorage opportunities, and the token's going to increase its collateral, which is going to increase the value of the token because the intrinsic collateral is growing. So to some degree, that can function as an inflation hedge, albeit it may not grow faster than inflation. Who knows? So that's the second mode of operation. And both of those are really nice, to be quite honest. Either one of those could function. I think V1 is not like the mode 1, as described, which is the V2 mode of operation, is not sustainable, right? That system is never going to like last forever. But when things are going really nicely, it could be something to lean more towards over time. But then having the option to have the second mode of operation where we can guarantee a price floor, and the price is just going to trade at that floor, and it's just going to gradually increase over time as the collateral increases. That's also a really nice system. So we have both of those, and then we have this system that allows us to slowly transition in between both of them if we wish. We can go hard into either one of them if we want. So we can set, so the parameter that controls this internally are a value called Z and then another value called D. And Z and D in combination with each other are what determine the behavior. So if we put Z and D both equal to 0, then we operate in mode 2. And if we put Z and D both equal to 100, then we operate in mode 1. But we can put Z and D into any other values in between, and Malt starts to operate in some kind of hybrid mode, where it will initially start out in mode 1 and be aggressive and just try to hold that hard peg. But then it will transition either slowly or fast, depending on, again, these values of Z and D, into mode 2. So it goes from mode 1 into mode 2. Mode 1 being the most aggressive, mode 2 being the conservative, but like guaranteed intrinsic value. And we can transition between the two. And that's a dynamic transition too, by the way. It's not just, oh, we're transitioning now. It's a function of how much malt that the protocol holds internally. So you can almost think about that globally as being some form of like global debt that the protocol is accruing to change its behavior. And as the debt grows as a percentage of its total market cap, or in fact, more accurately, its total collateral, then its behavior will change. So if that ratio is 10% of the total kind of malt in the protocol versus total collateral, then that's the value of the malt to capital ratio, as we call it in the white paper, is 10%, and then that determines the values of all of the other parameters like the malt swing trader entry price and the actual target price, which are values that you can read about in the white paper. But ultimately, that's all kind of noise. Like if you're interested in learning about that and the specifics of how Malt works, that's phenomenal. And go read that, and I'm here to answer questions. We've got Malt GPT, etc. But if you don't want to go read that, the TLDR of it is Malt buys malt when it uses its collateral to buy malt when it's cheap. It uses that malt that it bought to sell back to the market when it's expensive. And then it can do, eventually down the line, when we have multiple pools, it will do cross-pool arbitrage. And then there's this additional mechanism, which is the arbitrage auction, which is just a way of the protocol raising capital before the swing trader steps in. Instead of just having the swing trader step in, we raise some collateral or raise some capital from the community, use that to buy back malt to recover the peg. And in return for that capital that's been given to us by the community, the protocol gives them these arbitrage tokens, which capture the value of the swing trade on malt. So if malt is currently trading on the AMM at 90 cents, you could buy it at 90 cents and speculate on a swing back to $1. And that's exactly what you're doing with the arbitrage tokens. You're speculating on that swing, but malt's giving you some extra juice, which is priced in a Dutch auction. And the idea behind that is that Dutch auction allows the risk to be priced by the market for taking that swing trade. And the protocol will suck up any slippage that you might incur there and give you like a fixed execution price lower than the current market price. And we execute your exit as well efficiently. So you get the perfect capture of the value of the swing plus an additional premium that's given to you by the protocol. And that's it. That mechanism plus the below peg swing trader mechanism plus above peg swing trader selling, and also the protocol just minting new tokens. And all of those combined is high level. That's what the Malt protocol is. There's a bunch of math in the white paper. There's a bunch of code and a bunch of contracts, and it can look intimidating and scary, but Really, that's all it is. It's just we have a privileged contract internally called a swing trader, and that is just a savvy bot, for lack of a better term, that knows how to buy and sell malt to profit, and it uses the collateral to do so. And then we have these other stuff, and that's it. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. And the insights that I think we've had are, one, the assumption of being worth $1 doesn't have to hold. We can have whatever assumption that we want, and we have these other two of these inequalities. But more broadly, I think the approach that we're taking is novel because we're trying to stabilize on a per AMM pool basis. Pretty much every stablecoin that's ever existed tries to stabilize in a global way, either a global interest rate or a global mint redeem, where any pool on chain depegs, then there's an arb against the global redemption, things like that. We're not doing that. Instead, we're trying to stabilize on a per pool basis. So each pool is very self-contained. This AMM pool is currently trading at 80 cents, and it has its own set of contracts called a stabilizer pod that are accompanying that AMM pool. And all they're trying to do is make sure that that pool stays in line with the target price. That's it. And then there's another pool that gets deployed that has its own stabilizer pod that's completely separate. They have no knowledge of each other. So there's no global sense of stability in this. There are some global contracts that keep a track of how much total collateral we have and things like that, because that's useful information to know what our global collateralization is. But every pool is taking individual steps to stabilize only its own pool, not the global thing. And then we have these other systems that we will eventually roll out that operate in between the pools to arb across them. And that's how information flows between each of these stability pods. So if there's a global depeg, every pool will depeg, and then arbitrage between all of them will guarantee that they'll depeg roughly similar, which is then representative of like the global depeg, because they're all going to average out to be the right amount. So some pools might depeg more than others, but the arbitrage will stable that out. So then we'll just see a global depeg across all of them. But now we don't need to think about the complexity of all of the supply. Each pool is now just in charge of stabilizing its own pool, and it will try to do so. And some pools will be better than others are, and then arbitrage will level it out again. And that allows the stronger pools to in some way pull up and drag up the weaker pools. By the stronger pools push the price up, and then the arb between them now levels them out, which will pull the stronger pool down a little bit, but it will drag the weaker one up. And now we're back at a higher level globally. And that process is how Malt repegs itself over time. But it's a much simpler problem space to work in, and that's why we're going after this approach. And whether we're going to be proven right or not on this approach is still yet to be seen. But ultimately, that's been our goal, to go after that simple form of system and then try to grow it out as we prove the simpler systems, and then we can link these simple systems to become a much more complex, larger and global system. But that's our goal. But we're far from that. We've still got a lot of work to do for sure on that front. We have got a single pool, and it's taken us a long time to get here. But hopefully now that we've proven this and we have a few weeks of stability under our belt after we launch, that would give us some confidence to start trying to branch out to more pools and build out this larger arbitrage strategy, with the ultimate goal of having many pools, right? An ETH pool, a wrapped Bitcoin pool, Lido, like staked ETH, Rocket ETH, whatever we want, we can have pools for. And then each pool is individually collateralized, and each pool pays yield in the other token in the pool, right? So it's a Malt X pool. So whatever that X is the token you get paid in. So you want to earn yield in ETH, then you just provide Malt ETH liquidity and stake your LP token, and you're good to go. You're earning yield in ETH now. And in doing so, there's a market-driven mechanism that allows Malt to have its asset distribution, like the asset distribution within its collateral, to be market driven. Because each pool is self-collateralized, as the pool's TVL grows, the protocol is forced to grow its own collateral in that pool, because that's what happens when you start to do those kind of things. When you start to stabilize, it's going to naturally grow. So now we have this system where as more people provide liquidity into pools, that asset now increasingly has a bigger contribution to the Malt's total collateral. So that's a fully dynamical, market-driven system for distributing the asset allocation within the protocol. And that's not something that has ever really happened, to my knowledge, before. To have that kind of thing, it's usually an individual behind the scenes who makes these choices, but we're not going after that. We want to have like this really market-driven, fully decentralized kind of system where if coins start to not be loved by people, or they fall out of love, or they go to zero, whatever, the market will naturally react to that and remove it from Malt's collateral ultimately. And that might happen through, while that token is collapsing, the protocol is just arbing against the price collapse, and in doing so is managing to move a lot of its assets out of the collateral for that pool and into the collateral of other pools, because it's managing to do this kind of like arb capture of that. And I think there's many problems for us to solve there. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that we have solutions to all of these things. We don't at all. We've got some good solutions to our current problems, and we're going to continue working to have solutions to these bigger problems. But they'll come. I see no reason why we won't, especially as we start to grow. We're going to have more money available to us, and that's going to mean we can go out and really hire some experts that are really going to start bringing expertise to the team that we don't currently have. I would say I'm fairly good at what I do. I've built this protocol, but ultimately there's a limit to my knowledge, and I think I'm a fairly good ideas guy. I'm a generalist when it comes to like implementing stuff, but I'm gonna need a lot of help to get some of this off the ground, and we're already looking for that, and we've already got some great minds sharing ideas on this stuff as well. So I'm very excited for what we've got coming, and I think it's just been a long time coming. I think that's really what I am looking for. Just finding the thing that I want to work on, and knowing that it's worthwhile, and that keeps me going. And I think that's everything that I have to say today, really. I mean, I think if people want to come up and ask questions, they can. I'm happy to stay on and talk, but I don't want to take up too much time just rambling about a lot of this stuff, because I think there's the messages are simple at the end of the day. What we're trying to do is very simple. It's been a long time, and there's a lot of noise surrounding us and the project generally. A lot of people who have not been with us since the start maybe have an opinion that we're just like kind of an annual pump and dump, or like a stable is just trying to pump out huge APR for the degens or whatever. But at the end of the day, these have always been just means to an end for us. Going after these kind of high APR things was a means to an end. That was never the sole purpose of what we were doing. It's fun to build those things, of course, but we still have this larger vision of trying to build something that's a truly decentralized form of stability. And we're still working on what that even means, to be quite honest. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm still skeptical whether some of this is even possible. But the real point is that if there's any chance that it's possible, we have to be working on it, because the ramifications downstream are so large that it would be irresponsible not to work on this stuff. So yes, there are people who will think that we're just like a high APR Ponzi, or that we should just quit because it's not working. But I mean, at the end of the day, our vision is much bigger than what people perhaps give us credit for. We're trying to build something truly special, and we're not going to stand here and be arrogant and say that we're definitely going to achieve that, or that we're going to change the world in any real way, but we're going to try. We're going to put our heads down, we're going to work hard, and we're going to really try. And that's what we have been doing for over 2 years now, and we will continue to do so. And it's a hard problem, right? I would argue nobody solved it yet. There are some good attempts, but all of the stablecoins have some issues. There's none that you can really point to and say, this is like the canonical decentralized coin for DeFi, and everyone agrees. That doesn't exist yet. And maybe it will never exist. I don't know. Maybe it does become fractured and bifurcated over time. And I'm okay with that too. If we can play a role in that history, that would be interesting too. But it's worth finding out, and that's what we're on the journey to do. And I think we've got something really special, to be quite honest. I think we've built 3 versions, but I think I said this on Twitter yesterday, that ultimately it feels like this is V1. This is what Malt was always supposed to be, and the previous 2 versions weren't V1 and V2. They were V0.01 dash alpha and then V0.1, and now we've got a V1 for real. That's why we wrote a white paper this time, because we have something that feels done. It feels, or at least done to the point that it needs to be right now. There's still, as I say, lots to do, but it's done to a degree. It feels like a completed piece of work. That's really what I'm trying to say. And that's, it feels good for us to finally be there and release that as a white paper and say, here was the idea that we conceived of 2.5 years ago. But we didn't fully understand what the idea was, and we think we have a much better idea of what that is now, and that's in the white paper. And we'll continue to work on the idea, because I still think it's got juice, and a lot of people have said they would have given up if they were in my position, or that some people say I should have given up. And I've said to everyone who says that to me, I will give up the day that I feel like there's no juice left to squeeze out of the idea. And I mean that purely as the idea, not any kind of financial motivation on that, because I've not made any money out of Malt. We paid out of our own pocket to reimburse people for V2, so it's not really driven by money with Malt, because I'm fortunate enough to kind of have other things going on in my life that fill that gap for me. So Malt allows me to be the person that just works on the thing that I have like an ideological drive for, rather than a financial incentive. It's like, I believe in the technology, that this is fundamentally good. And maybe I'm willing to debate that with other people, because there's loads of perspectives, and I think there's very valid perspectives that could make the argument that DeFi is not good for the world. But I'm happy to stake my claim on this little bit DeFi and say that this is my piece of the world, and this is my contribution to the world, and that will be however big it ends up being. But it's all I've got to give, and I'm going to give it as best I can, and that's where we are. And I know that everybody who's listening to this and people who followed me know that, and that's why you're still here. Because, any sane person wouldn't be here, I would suspect, because, I think we all have to be a little delusional to even believe in DeFi. Let alone believe that we can make our own form of money and have it work. Like, that is utterly insane. But here we are. That's what we're doing. And we're all being insane together, I guess, and trying to build something that's worthwhile. And that's really what it comes down to in cryptos. There's a separation between that and the kind of pump and dump stuff, the money grab, the cash grab stuff. And people get really jaded by the cash grab stuff, and they forget that not everybody's out there to get you. Not everybody's scamming you. Not everybody's driven by money even. Some people are driven just by building cool things that deserve to be built. Ideas that deserve to be tested. Whether it comes out to be worth it or not, as in the project may not work, but it's worth exploring anyway. And I don't ever think that can be a failure. If you explored something that was worth exploring and it turned out to not be viable, then that was still a worthwhile exploration, because you found out it wasn't viable, and that's contributed to the sum of all human knowledge. And DeFi, the sum of all DeFi knowledge in the world is not very big, because it's a very young industry, and there's not that many people in the grand scheme of it working on DeFi in a real way. There's people forking things left and right, but even then, the total number is still small. But the number of people really trying to build novel things is very small in the grand scheme of it, and it takes time. It really does, because we don't have the answers, and that's what we're doing. But It's kind of the grander vision, kind of where I'm at with that. But in the short term, here's how my plan kind of looks for Malt. So we're going to launch next week, obviously. And then we launch on Polygon with a Malt die pool. Just a single pool. And again, by design, because that's how we're going to prove out the system. We're going to learn if it works. We're going to learn where it doesn't work, where it can be improved, things like that. We can iron all that out. And that's the journey we've been on for 2.5 years. But once we have that, which I hope we will in a few weeks, then we can prove out some cross-pool strategies. So that's probably going to be roll out another AMM pool on a different DEX, for example. Maybe we have a quick swap one, maybe we have one on Kyber or Sushi or Balancer or wherever it happens to be. But still Malt die. And then we build out ARB infrastructure for that to get that working. And then once we've got that, we can roll out USDC and other stable pools. All the while, we'll be working on the non-stable tech. Once we've got that, we roll that out. That's really the holy grail for us. If we can get there, that would be unbelievable. Because then we're in a situation where you can earn yield in ETH that's generated from real activities, real revenue. It's not vaporware. It's not made up emissions-based yield or anything. It's real, and it's paid to you in ETH. And you can just put your money there and earn that kind of yield in ETH. And then if we do that with kind of liquid staking derivatives, now we're getting into a place where you're earning extra juice on owning liquid staking derivatives. That kind of stuff is just like really unlocking like really beautiful things in DeFi. So I think that's our kind of short to mid-term goal to do that. Once we're at that point, we can really start to think about branching out onto different chains. And at that point, there's nothing holding us back. We can go anywhere and start laying our claim as being a player in the stablecoin system across the entirety of DeFi. And if we can get there, that would be amazing. That's really where we're aiming for. And if ultimately, if we're still going and people are still enjoying what we're doing and the tech is still working, we'll be building an AMM, because that's the absolute end goal. If we control everything I've already said with the non-stable pools, etc., 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 and then we also have our own DEX, then we unlock so much potential, because one, the ARB infrastructure could be whitelisted on the DEX for 0 fees. So then we just instantly obliterate any other competition, because if there's, let's say, a 30 basis points fee on the DEX and the swing trader doesn't have to pay that 30 basis points, then the stabilization is happening very efficiently and incredibly competitively. Any other kind of MEV searcher that's looking for an edge there is immediately starting at a 30 basis points disadvantage, and that's huge when we're talking about the kinds of edges that exist in this space. 30 basis points is pretty huge. So that's like a really great place to be, and that's just one layer, but there's many other layers you can build on top of that, where you can really get into situations where the ARB infrastructure can happen during the trade. As you're swapping on the AMM, it's possible to maybe execute some of the ARB before your trade, because we know the implications that your trade is going to have on the market price. And if we can execute before you get in, we can reduce your overall slippage, while the protocol still captures some of that value of the slippage that you incur. And that is another additional kind of benefit to using that DEX, because now it's a lower slippage DEX. And perhaps it's even, we can lower the fees versus other DEXs, because there's a native source of yield built into the DEX. And every other kind of coin has to fight for those kind of liquidity incentives, because they don't have a native source of yield. So on DEXs, they have to charge a fee, because that's the only way they can give LPs yield. And other stable coins have to fight for liquidity incentives, because they have no native source of yield. So they have to compete in the curve wars, for example. And all of that stems out of the lack of a native incentive. Malt has that. So if we have 0 slippage or 0 fee on the DEX for the swing trader, we have a massive edge. And then we have low slippage for traders because of this kind of ARB infrastructure executing, which is a huge benefit, and this additional yield that's coming to LPs. It really starts to add up to look like a pretty attractive package. And then from there, like, we can build out whatever we want. depending on what the market wants at the time, and build out interesting products for institutions. We can build out interesting products for other DeFi protocols. We can build out like in interesting stuff across the board, and that's going to be those are the really interesting things to try and tackle, to try and grow. But before we get there, we don't want to over optimize those things until we know that what we've got is working, because we can't do the traditional move fast and break things, because to do that we would have to give ourselves an egregious amount of control over the contracts, and if we did that, the thing looks way too centralized right from the get-go. And we want this to be a project that stands on its own two legs at the end of the day. Malt is not a product by us, as in like a company, right? Malt's a protocol that just exists in the world, and it just happens to be built by a company. And ultimately, the company will cease to exist as well, because it will just be subsumed into what becomes a DAO that runs the thing. And my dream is to be able to untether all of our team, myself and everyone, away from Malt, so that it just runs on its own eventually. I think there's way too much of a sense that you have to squeeze all possible value out of everything, and you have to make sure that nobody can encroach on your IP, and you have to grow and be around forever, because why else would you build a company? But I fundamentally disagree with that, to be quite honest. I think companies should die. Companies have a shelf life, and once they've outlived that shelf life, they should disappear. And there's some companies that are supposed to serve a purpose that is, by definition, short-lived, and I think that's what we are. Ultimately, we're building a decentralized protocol. We have to have some control of it to make changes, to do things, but we don't need so much control that we can abuse that, right? So the kind of dev team, multi-sig, can't mint new tokens. It's impossible. It can mint through a time lock, because it does have access to the time lock, but then of course we have to wait 3 days to get that. So there is that protection in there for the community, and I encourage people to build all sorts of tooling and infrastructure to monitor that kind of behavior, because if I or anyone else ever goes rogue, I want everybody to know about it immediately, and that's why we've built it this way. But we do need some control to change certain internal parameters, to tweak behavior, to make sure that things are working well, and because we still don't know where all of these values inside the protocol are going to land and how they should be to operate optimally. So we need some scope to change those, but we don't need the scope to rug the protocol. So we don't have that. That's hidden from us, and we've done it that way specifically, intentionally, because we ultimately want to give ourselves the least privilege we need to do our job effectively, and then ultimately we turn off that privilege and we hand it over to be completely controlled by a time lock, and the time lock is completely controlled by a DAO, and the company at that point can cease to exist. I think it probably won't. For a while we'll continue to build and be the kind of thought leaders, for lack of a better term, within the ecosystem, where we're presenting our own ideas, but ultimately it's a meritocracy, and anybody can suggest ideas, and anybody can put forth implementations if they wish, and those implementations can be voted on and integrated into the protocol. It doesn't have to come from the team, because the team is no longer a thing at that point. We're just the kind of figureheads, perhaps, where people look to us as authority figures within the community, because we built the thing. We came up with the idea and we built it, but ultimately it's not ours. And it's that feeling of ownership that I think a lot of teams have, and they kind of miss that that's defeating the point of what they're trying to do in the first place. You shouldn't feel ownership over the idea. You are just the custodian of the execution, of the implementation of the idea. But the idea itself is everybody's. And that's the real DeFi ethos. And that's my ethos. That's how I think it should be, because that's how things really get built well. We launch, somebody forks us, does it better. We can take some of their ideas. They can take some of ours. And over time, everybody gets better. And people get scared of that. I've had people like concerned about people like potentially forking our code. And I don't have an issue with it, because at the end of the day, people are going to trust the original team always more than any fork. It's just like the sense of legitimacy in the real team is much greater than the legitimacy of a fork. Of course, the original team has better chops to execute on this. At least that's the default opinion. Until another team proves otherwise, you have to assume that. And I'm confident that I can out innovate on Malt anybody who wants to try, because I've had 2.5 years of advantage thinking about these problems. You're going to have to play catch up on that. And I'm happy to fight that corner. And if somebody out innovates me, that's great. Honestly, I don't mind that, because my ego is not big enough to worry about that. Because why am I doing this? I'm not doing it for money. If I was doing it for money, sure, that would hurt my ego. But if somebody out innovates me, it just means that the idea is really good. And the idea is standing on its own 2 feet well enough for some better executor to do it even better. And then we learn from that, because we can take their ideas and run with those. And then maybe we innovate on their ideas and back and forth. And collectively, we improve very quickly. And that's my goal. I'm not trying to build $1 billion company. I'm trying to build $1 billion protocol, and make enough for myself to live and eat. That's really the goal. But I guess that's got way off topic, so I'm digress on that little tangent. But I do think it's important that you know some of the kind of philosophical positions that I take and why I do some of the things I do, because it's easy to paint that with a brush of like everybody seems to be like just out to cash grab or try like become an influencer or anything like things like that. But there are people out there, many people in fact, who are genuinely just trying to build cool things, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think the community around us knows that, because we have, even if I do say so myself, I think we have one of the best communities. It may not be the biggest. I'm hoping it gets bigger, but the quality, the signal to noise that exists in our community is very high. And I'm very grateful for that. So yeah, I guess if anybody has any questions, like, you can come up or ask them in the Discord. Otherwise, I think we can call this one finished, and then yeah, we'll go on. There'll be more details probably tomorrow about the whitelist. But the TLDR on that is, if you're in V1 and V2, you're golden. You're going to get whatever we're going to give you. And everybody's going to get the same allocation. There's going to be no kind of insiders getting significant allocations. I think like some of the team will get larger allocation, but that's our reward. We get to buy our own protocol. That seems fair. But other than that, there's no large VCs or any kind of large underhanded deals being done. It is as fair as we can make it. It's for everyone in V1 and V2, and then I'm sure over the course of the next week we'll give away some whitelist spots in the Discord and things like that. And then yeah, then we go from there, and hopefully we last longer than 24 hours. That's really the ultimate goal. And then we build and build and build until either we build something great or we can build no more. And that will be the end of it. So I think that's it. Nobody seems to have any questions, so I will call it there and speak to everyone very shortly.